All right, so we are now fully set up and ready to go, and we're going to speak today about something that we really haven't spoken very much about. I think it's been in the background. We focused a lot on constitutional crisis, on creeping autocracy, on the apparent support of many Americans for a more unilateral and expansive kind of executive power, a diminishing of Congress's power, maybe a diminishing of the court's capacity to restrict the executive. And I think that there's a natural priority to that, which is to say that political despotism is something that once it takes root is very hard to overcome, that institutions, culture, commitment, values that have been built over generations are made of quite fragile stuff, and that they can be broken relatively easily. And once they are, they're very difficult to repair. And so I've focused there, but we do know, right, that the really focal instrument of economic policy for the Trump administration right now is tariffs, and this is prompted in part by the announcement that on Tuesday, April 2nd, 25% cross the board tariffs will go into effect on automobiles and components to automobiles that are imported from anywhere in the world, from Japan, from Europe, but also from China and Canada and Mexico, our most important trading partners. And I want to emphasize, right, this is one aspect of a broader agenda. We're seeing cross the board tariffs on almost everything imported from China, and it appears that there will be more tariffs going into effect soon on goods imported from Mexico and Canada, our two closest trading partners, as well as from Europe, and that it is the conviction of this administration that tariffs are a constructive tool to use, not only to generate leverage to exact concessions from our adversaries and our allies, but also as a way to restructure the global economy. And if the second idea is right, if these aren't just strategic moves that will be removed as soon as the country does what you want it to do. If there is a conviction that actually having long term stable tariffs in place against many of the largest trading partners of the United States, both countries with which we view ourselves primarily as economic and diplomatic and military rivals, but also with countries with whom we view ourselves as at least up until this point, allied, right? That we are cooperative with them. I think Canada and Europe would be the clearest examples, right? We share values with them, we share a political system with them, we are literally part of treaty organizations that make us military allies of them, and we have been working together and building trust and relationships across generations or even centuries, that even against those countries, it is appropriate to try to unwind the degree of economic integration, the degree of globalization, the degree of trade, the degree of the integration of productive processes. And so presumably many of you or all of you are watching what we're doing right now, right? This class on a computer, on a phone, on a television, some kind of electronic device, right? And so if you notice maybe a couple things about it, right? That these devices are ubiquitous, and part of the reason they're ubiquitous is because they've become relatively affordable for most everyone in our society. And then we add, well, how did that happen? Well, it happened as a result of this global integration. And what that means is that it's not just right that maybe this phone, this computer, this TV has a brand name on it that indicates that it's a Japanese company or a Korean company or maybe a European, a German company. But frankly, if we were to pull open the hood, look inside, what we would see is that the components in these devices come from maybe 20 or 30 or 40 different countries, and that whoever manufactured it, that company may be headquartered and owned primarily in Japan or South Korea or Germany or Silicon Valley, but they are sourcing the materials out of which they make their devices from all over the world, that they actually have manufacturing located in many different countries, and that this is part of the way that this very advanced technology has become more affordable. But if we believe that the costs of this level of global integration outweigh the benefits. Yes, we like our cheap electronics, but we should like our manufacturing jobs more. And by the way, if we were able to bring our manufacturing jobs back, the term that's being used in the Trump administration is reshoring, right? We offshored them to China, let's reshore them back to the United States, then our workers might make enough so that they could afford more expensive American made goods. And so it would be a win-win proposition. Maybe too bad for China, but good for America. And let's put America first. Let's make America great again. Tariffs are actually not just something we do to bully and cajole other countries into doing what we want them to do, maybe get them to drop some of their tariffs on our goods. They're actually part of a long-term strategy for slowly or quickly disintegrating the global economy, moving back to, in other words, a less integrated global economy. So America versus the world, which one is going to break, right? And this is part of making America great again, is making us a hub of manufacturing, making it the case that the majority of what we consume in America is made in America, and therefore the jobs that manufacture the goods that we consume are located here. We become more equal as a society. We have a better working class, a better middle class, more unionized jobs with greater benefits as well as higher levels of pay. And please note, a lot of what I'm saying, obviously, I think are worthy goals to pursue. The question is whether tariffs are the right instrument to pursue them. And so I've got the cartoon image, which I stole from Paul Krugman, of the drunk holding on to the lamppost. And you may know that the saying in the background here is that some people rely on theories in the way that drunks hold on to lampposts, not for illumination, only for support, right? And so my suggestion is that actually, although there's a theory, the tariffs could do all of these good things for our economy, the theory is not a very good theory. The theory doesn't, I don't think, hold up to scrutiny. And the reason that people surrounding Trump are relying on this theory, they may mean it, they may believe it, but the reason they've been chosen to be the Treasury Secretary, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, one of the main economic counselors to the president, is because Donald Trump likes tariffs, not because he understands this theory or because this theory is a good theory and he wants to use tariffs for political reasons. And the fact that he has a bunch of people surrounding him saying, by the way, we could accomplish all this other great stuff with tariffs, is egging him on, right? And supporting him, and to put it slightly negatively, not restraining him, not inhibiting him. And so by all accounts, Donald Trump really likes tariffs, and he's liked tariffs for maybe 40 years. And he thinks that the United States has been a sucker for allowing other countries to impose tariffs on our goods, but not imposing reciprocal tariffs on their good, and that globalization, all things equal, has made America less great, and that we should undo it. But having said that, the idea that this could actually work, I think, is a catastrophic mistake. And in his first term, he was surrounded by people who were able to say to him, you can't do this. Look at what it's doing to the stock market. Look at what it's doing to the economy. Don't you want to be popular? Don't you want to retain your support so that you can win a second term? You got to cool it on the tariffs if that's what you want. And that in 2025, Donald Trump is not surrounded by those people. He's surrounded by people who subscribe to the theory that tariffs are, I'm sorry, the pixie dust, the magic wand that will let us somehow magically restore a more equal, more manufacturing based, and ultimately better economy for all Americans. And the result is that he's fully unrestrained in implementing this policy. In fact, not inhibited, but encouraged by his advisors to do so. And so I think we need to take this seriously, and especially if I am correct in thinking, on the one hand, that Donald Trump is doing this primarily for political reasons, not for economic reasons. And second of all, that the economic analysis of tariffs that suggests there's a very high likelihood that this is going to cause a severe recession, that it's also going to be inflationary, that the costs will be borne exactly by the people who Trump is trying to help with them, that they will pay higher prices and they cannot afford to do so in light of the long-standing stagnation of their wages, the affordability crisis that has been brewing for a long time in the country, that this is going to be a catastrophic miscalculus, and that the people who might push back, or the sensitivity to the feedback the market and other economic indicators are going to give that this is misfiring, is not going to matter as much to Trump in 2025 or 2026. Maybe he wants the Republicans to do well in the midterm election so he can maintain his majority in Congress. I don't think he really thinks he's running for a third term, right? And by the way, I think the lesson he drew from his first term is that he was a fool to listen to his advisors instead of listening to his instincts. And so he has surrounded himself with people who agree with him, who are committed to enabling him, who are committed to making sure that this time there is an effective administration, an effective strategy for Donald Trump's ideas, whatever they are, becoming the ruling ideas of his administration and of the federal government as long as he is president. And so the idea that we may on Tuesday actually see 25% tariffs, and that we may see an escalating trade war or tariffs going back and forth between us and our trading partners, and that this may continue for some years, is, I think, worth focusing on and trying to figure out what the implications are. So just a little bit of background information. And so one of the things that's, I think, a little confusing here is that these tariffs have been on again, off again, threatened, and maybe even imposed, but then immediately walked back. And so we've got a couple different ways of thinking about the timeline and analyzing what they do, right? Two rounds of 10% tariffs on Chinese goods. And I think it's important to recognize, right, that the tariffs from the first Trump administration on Chinese goods were already in place. And so from February 4th, a 10% import, from March 4th, an additional 10% import. So China has been under fairly heavy tariffs since the early weeks of the Trump administration, increasing at the beginning of this month. And I suspect, right, many American families will notice this, especially around Christmas time, when the toys they want to buy, when the new electronics they want to buy, the things they want to give for Christmas are 20% more expensive or more. Um, that is when these tariffs will really begin to bite into the American economy and the American consumer. So Canada and Mexico, and I need to explain a little bit here, right? 25% on most goods that do not fall under the USMCA trade pact. And so that's the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. And this is a trade pact that replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement. Probably NAFTA is more familiar. It was more of a big deal. And to just say a little bit about the background here, right? So, as early as the early 1960s, the United States had a free trade agreement with Canada that allowed manufactured goods to go freely back and forth between our two countries with no tariffs, similar for some agricultural goods as well. And that then in the 1990s, Bill Clinton negotiated a similar agreement that included Mexico, and now we have the North American Free Trade Agreement and goods and services going back and forth between Mexico, the United States, and Canada in most instances without taxes or tariffs. And I'll just point out to you in terms of the volume and value of goods moving around, in terms of the integration of the productive processes, North America is the most integrated continent in the world right now. That may surprise you, right? You think of the European Union with a single currency, right? A much longer standing trade pact that eventually grew into a kind of continental government structure as well. Well, shouldn't they have a more integrated economy? And as I understand it, actually, regional economics is still more important given the nature of governmental policy in Germany and Italy and France, the big economies. We could add Britain, even though they have now formally withdrawn from the European Union. So that Europe is not actually as integrated as North America is. Asia, there's a lot of integration, but not as integrated as North America. And then, by the way, Trump in 2016, campaigning against Hillary Clinton, says that the trade agreement that her husband negotiated, that she supported, is the worst trade agreement in the history of humankind, right? And it has to be either trashed or reformed. And he gets into office. And so this is one of his signature accomplishments. He has renegotiated NAFTA to make it much better for American workers. I think most economic analysts who look at the substance of the differences between the USMCA and NAFTA conclude that there was a little bit of tinkering around the edges, but most of the components of NAFTA stayed in place, that this was essentially an exercise in branding that allowed the president to say that he had a new trade agreement and that it was much better for America. And I want you to pay attention to that for a second because it suggests that optics and politics, much more than economics, may be driving aspects of Trump's economic stance. He wants to be able to hit his opponents with the cudgel of you signed a bad trade pact and claim that he had the power and the foresight and the savvy to negotiate a better agreement when in fact there's very little difference between the two agreements as I understand it. Now, having said that, right, so he exempts the things from the agreement that now bears his initials as opposed to NAFTA, that his acronym, I guess I should say, but he does put a trade tariff in partial effect against Canada and Mexico on March 6th. This is a little confusing, but as you can see, the green is paused, right? So there were announced tariffs, right, from February that were paused until March. Some of them put in place in Mexico and Canada, but frankly, very small. Some of them put partially in place, right? And what's happening apparently on April 2nd is a much larger tariff will fall on Mexico, Canada, and the rest of the world. Let's just notice, right, that there are also tariffs in place on aluminum and steel now, and this is driving aluminum and steel prices up in the United States and the rest of the world. I don't think we need to talk much more about that, but that this has been an uneven path, but it does seem that this has been a process of, if you will, revving the engines, warming up the tariff machine. And if I've got it right, in a sense, I hope I don't, but it does appear we're on the cusp of a sustained effort to really implement tariffs against many of the largest trading partners on many of the goods that we import into the world. And we should anticipate, by the way, that those countries will retaliate, that they will have similar levels of tariffs on American goods. And by the way, China is already retaliating. Canada apparently already has retaliation organized. The Europeans already have plans to retaliate. And please note, they're being pretty strategic about it. They're planning on retaliating against goods primarily exported from or manufactured in the states that voted for Donald Trump, right? And sort of punish the Trump supporters in the hopes that if they suffer, they will lobby Trump to change course, that Trump will be more sensitive to their suffering than he would be to suffering in blue states, and so that there's a really targeted approach to reciprocating. Very quickly, just in terms of thinking about how tariffs work, and I assume the basics are clear, right? Which is to say, BMW ships a cargo ship full of cars to the United States. Let's say they arrive in Oakland, California, and they're going to be moved off the boat there. Well, before they can actually arrive on the dock, the company has to pay the US Treasury the amount of the tariff to allow those goods into the country. And so in BMW's case, right, they're going to have to pay 25% of the value of a shipload of BMWs, right? And by the way, BMW is a for-profit company and it operates on a pretty narrow margin. And when it has to shell over, right, a large amount of money to the US government, it's going to need to recoup that money, right? It doesn't have the margin of profit that allows it to swallow a 25% loss. And so they are going to, right, increase the cost of BMWs by something like 25% in the American market. And by the way, the German, right, government is not going to be happy about this, and both economically and politically, they're going to be impelled to retaliate. And so when economists try to map this out, right, they look at two different scenarios, limited retaliation and full retaliation, and they suggest if you look at the effects on the American economy of a 20% tariff on China, 25% on Mexico and Canada. So this is not yet taking into account the tariffs on Europe, that in the short term, it is likely to cause a severe recession, a contraction of the American economy by something approaching 1%, right? Which is a pretty severe recession. And that maybe over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, we would figure out how to relocate some of the manufacturing to our country. I'll talk about another scenario in a moment, which may be that some of the manufacturing will leave the United States as well, but that eventually we will recover. But when we recover, not only have we suffered through a recession, the overall productivity of our economy, the overall wealth creation in our economy has diminished, right? And so the thought on the part of most economists is that this is going to be painful in the short term and destructive in the long term. And when I say most economists, this is a survey that was done recently asking who pays for the tariffs, right? And how confident are you in your assessment of who pays for the tariffs? And please note, economists are a contentious lot. They don't tend to see eye to eye, but it turns out 95% of economists strongly agree with the idea that a substantial portion of the tariffs will be borne by consumers in the country that enact the tariffs, right? And when you ask them, what are you confident of? That goes up to 96%. And please note, right, that when you look at who disagrees, strongly disagrees, right, 0% of economists strongly disagree, and a very negligible portion disagree at all, right? And so the idea that this is going to make things more expensive for Americans. People try to total up the amount that the currently announced tariffs will cost average Americans, and the range is between $1,500 and $3,000 a year. And by the way, part of the reason there's such a big range is because some of these studies notice, look, if automobiles from Germany become more expensive, right? And automobiles from Japan become more expensive, and even the automobiles made in the United States, but with components from all over the world, have to become more expensive because those components have to pay tariffs. Even the automobiles made almost entirely in the United States, which there are very few, but Tesla is one of them, they're likely to become more expensive because it's a competitive marketplace. And when everything else becomes more expensive, two things happen. The first is that other prices can go up, right? They're not being driven down by competition anymore. And the second thing is probably domestic wages have to go up because domestic workers have to pay more to get what they are used to consuming. They need higher pay to be able to do that. They will demand higher pay. And then the cost of even making the American manufactured stuff goes up. By the way, a lot of the American manufactured stuff is made with supply stock that comes from elsewhere in the world that will have tariffs imposed on it. So you have utensils made in the United States, right? But they're made from steel or aluminum that's imported from elsewhere in the world. Then the input cost is going to go up, and the cost of those goods will go up, even though they're manufactured in the United States. So I'm inclined to think that the high figure, $2,000 to $3,000 per family per year in the United States of increased expenses as a result of these tariffs, in addition to a recession, is accurate. And what that means is that we will likely, over the next couple of years, experience what's referred to as stagflation, simultaneous inflation, and a stagnant or recessionary economy. And by the way, that kind of economic problem is very hard to address through standard policy tools. The policy tools that fight inflation tend to contract the economy, so you don't want to use those when you're in a recession. The tools that you use to fight a recession tend to risk inflation. You don't want to use those while you're already experiencing inflation. This was the problem, of course, of the 1970s, that there wasn't a good toolkit to fight stagflation. I don't think we've got a good toolkit in 2025 either. Who are the tariffs likely to hit hardest? And this is pretty simple math. The people who spend the largest proportion of their income on consumption will be the people who pay the largest proportion of their disposable income for the tariffs or the increase in cost that the tariffs cause. One way to think about this is that a tariff is a consumption tax, and consumption taxes are classically regressive taxes. They make everything more expensive, everybody buys everything, but the people who can least afford the increased expense are the people on the bottom of the economic ladder. And so the bottom 10%, 20%, 30% are paying a higher percentage of their disposable income than are people in the top 20 or 30%. So a regressive tax. And just a little bit more information about this. I'm sorry, that shouldn't say paradise there. That's a mistake. Who pays for tariffs and why this matters, right? Um, this is just a little bit of data about shoes, right? And as you can see, right, this is the amount of tariff imposed on a average pair of shoes entering the United States, right? And it's gone up to $1.50. A large portion of our shoes are imported from China. It's phenomenal to drill into the details of this. The average cost of manufacturing shoes in China, right, which includes both labor and the supplies, the leather, the rubber, etc. This is where the Nikes are made, for instance, is around $14 per pair of shoes, right? And so those shoes cannot be made for that cost in the United States. They're likely to still continue to come from China, but now this right tariff is going to be passed along. And please note the way in which, right, there's a very precise correlation between the increase in the cost of the tariff and the increase in the cost of the shoe. It's being passed along. Now, one more thing I think to take into account when we think about this, and we've looked at this diagram on several occasions together before. People sometimes refer to this as one of the most illuminating diagrams on economics that you can consult. And what it shows, right, is how much things have increased in price by various big categories of expense over a 20-year period from 1998 to 2018. And please note, right, that obviously we're now 7 years later than that. And the previous 7 years have been a period of inflation. So this may not be fully accurate at this point. But having said that, I think it does capture at least something really important about that 20-year period. And that is that a whole bunch of stuff became much more expensive, right? Hospital services went up by more than 200%, right? College tuition went up by more than 180%. Childcare went up 120%, as did medical services. Housing went up more than 50%, right? Which is, by the way, the overall rate of inflation is 56% over this 20-year period. And on the other hand, cars did not become more expensive. Clothing did not become more expensive. And other things like toys and TVs actually became considerably cheaper over this period. And we've done this exercise before. What differentiates the stuff that became more expensive from the stuff that didn't or became less expensive? The fact that the stuff that became less expensive can be made in China, whereas you can't get your hospital services or your college education or your childcare in China, right? And so the stuff that stays in the United States that isn't offshored or outsourced grows in cost much more rapidly than the stuff that can be. And by the way, what tariffs do is make it more expensive to purchase stuff that can be outsourced and has been outsourced, and hopefully over time leads that stuff to come back home, but then all that other stuff is going to get more expensive, right? Either indirectly due to tariffs or directly because it's being manufactured in a place where labor costs and supply costs and real estate costs, where all the input costs are more expensive. And so then one more variable to think about it. That is what's happening to wages and household income over this same period. Wages are decreasing, household income is stagnant or decreasing over this 20-year period. Fortunately, some of this data has gotten a little bit better since then, but in general, I think the thing to recognize is when you have stagnant wages, decreasing income, and increasing prices for core goods that people cannot do without, they can't do without housing, food, childcare, or education, right? Then you have an affordability crisis. And that one of the ways people have coped with this affordability crisis is through compensatory consumption of the cheaper goods, right? I'll get a new car and I'll feel better about having to live further away from my job because I've been forced out by the housing costs in the city where my job is. At least I'm commuting in a nice, comfortable car to work, right? And that this is going to be um, made more difficult. Compensatory consumption, finding some stuff you can still afford is going to be made more difficult by the consumption tax that tariffs represent. So let's just look for a moment at some of the indicators that a lot of people are looking at to see how the markets, how people are reacting to the Trump economic policy. I'm sorry, I accidentally advanced. And we have a few different metrics here. One of them is Wall Street, right? And so please note, right, the difference that surrounding himself with mainstream economic advisors made in his first term, at least in the first, right, year of his first term, the economy just went, I'm sorry, the market, the stock market just went up and up, right? And please note, in the second term, it has cratered, right? And so this is an indication that the markets think that Trump is serious about tariffs, that they think that his economic team in 2025 is fundamentally different from his economic team in 2017, and that they're deeply worried that this is going to spur trade wars and be economically destructive. Long-term expectations of inflation, and this is on the part now of consumers. This is the Michigan survey of consumer sentiment. And please note, right, what has happened in just really the last month, right? After the recovery from COVID and inflation, yes, egg prices went up. Yes, expectations for inflation remained kind of stubborn, right? But now they've jumped, right, from around 3% to around 4%. That's a substantial increase, and that affects people's economic behavior. Similarly, consumer sentiment, right? It really has gone down. This is a slightly different measure. What do you think of the condition of the economy right now, right? And in both regards, average Americans are suggesting they think the economy is moving in the wrong direction, and it appears that they are thinking about tariffs, thinking about deportation, thinking about the disorganization of the government that results from the Doge efforts to fire a bunch of officials and reorganize a bunch of government agencies. And on the other hand, I think it's worthwhile noting that we are sharply split, right? We live in a highly partisan and segregated information universe. And so Democrats, right, since Trump has been elected, have plunged in their confidence in the economy, their judgment of how the economy is doing, whereas Republicans have moved up dramatically. This does happen when presidential administrations change, but the degree of the collapse of democratic consumer confidence, I think, is stunning, right? And please note, right, we've talked about this before, that Republicans cheer louder and boo harder. It does appear that if the Democrats are not it's subject to a kind of amplification of sentiment here because their media system does that less, then there's real and deep worry among half the population that the president's economic policy is going to be catastrophic. So, with all of that in mind, I now want to ask, why is Trump so attracted to tariffs? And I want to suggest a kind of economic argument that I think is appealing to him. But before I do that, I want to look into a political argument because I think, frankly, the political argument is much more explanatory than the economic argument. And in certain respects, it's much more convincing. Not in the sense that I think it makes us reconsider whether tariffs will be helpful and healthy for our economy, but at least in the sense that it helps us to understand why Trump is doing this, even if it is going to be economically destructive, as most mainstream economists believe it will be. So let's start with the idea that tariffs rest on the implausible claim that it's only unfair global trade that has generated the rise in inequality, the loss of good manufacturing jobs during the neoliberal economic era. And so I want to start right with the idea that this is a bad diagnosis, and from a bad diagnosis, of course, bad prescriptions tend to follow. Why suggest that it's only unfair global trade, and what does that miss out on? And here I want to suggest, right? I've used the term neoliberal economic era. I'm referring to the period from roughly 1980 to 2020, from Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's ascendancy and the economic advisors who surrounded them, combating stagflation with a policy that cuts taxes, that raises interest rates, that tolerates high levels of unemployment, that tries to limit the level of unionization in their society, or at least the power of unions to influence public policy, and that ultimately opens the world to much higher levels of global trade. And obviously, there are other things that go on in this era as well. The rise of digital technology, the rise of automation, right? The move to robotics and manufacturing, but also the way in which digital technology allows for the integration of global supply chains and productive processes. Apple in right Silicon Valley in California can push a button on a computer, and 5 minutes later, plans for the new iPhone are being implemented in a factory in China, right? And so that wasn't possible prior to the technological revolutions. But let's back up for a second. How did the neoliberal revolution start? It started with tax cuts. It started with social disinvestment. It started with union breaking campaigns. And to say that it's all because China took our jobs is to put on blinders and to fail to recognize that there are other factors because, frankly, you don't want to blame those other factors. You want to continue to implement and make permanent regressive tax reform policy. And if that's part of the explanation, well, how convenient to have an alternative explanation that focuses all of the attention on China or globalization and none of the attention on domestic tax policy or social disinvestment, withdrawing funding from schools, no longer investing in affordable housing to bolster the middle class, right? So, right, the alternative contributing factors include rapid and unregulated technological change, the creation of a political and economic climate hostile to unions, social disinvestment in the infrastructure of economic mobility, right? The things that we did during the New Deal to bolster the middle class, to strengthen it, to create access to it. So having affordable, high quality education and affordable housing close to job centers would be good illustrations of this. And regressive tax reform and the failure to explore updated progressive alternatives, a wealth tax, universal basic income, things that might strengthen the middle class if you were willing to tax the upper echelons of the income and wealth ladder so that you could fund those programs. The third thing I want to note quickly, right? This is not just the Republicans, right? This is very much the Democrats, and by the way, mainstream economists, the neoliberals, but in certain respects, people who were less ideologically narrow nevertheless went along with these general ideas. They're to blame for the trends, right? So, in a sense, we're all to blame. There's enough blame to go around. It's Clinton and it's Obama as much as it is Reagan and presidents named Bush. And by the way, I think we're right to be angry about this, right? And by the way, Trump in his first term is also to blame for having passed some of the most regressive tax reform that our country has seen. So if you accept, right, that this is a complex set of factors that has been admittedly destructive to the middle class and the working class in the United States in ways we've talked about many times before. People are more precarious. They're struggling to make ends meet. They feel unseen, left out. They feel that the political process is unresponsive to them. Then what can a president do, especially a president who is unwilling to restore progressive taxation and use it to restore the infrastructure of middle class economic mobility? Well, one thing that the president has in his uh, executive authority to use fairly much at his will and whim, capriciously, if you will, because Congress has given him the power to do this, is tariffs, right? And so, in a sense, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you can use tariffs, well, let's use tariffs and let's find an economic theory that suggests that tariffs are the right tool to treat what's plaguing us. So, my suggestion here is that the politics are driving the economic diagnosis much more than the economic diagnosis being accurate and then generating the remedy. Tariffs assume that unwinding the globalization process is possible, right? And that it will counteract what it, at least putatively, has caused inequality and precariousness. And I want to suggest let's just grant, right, as for the sake of argument, that globalization is the primary cause of increased inequality and growing precariousness, the hollowing out of the middle class. The economic studies do not support this, but let's assume that it were right. Would it therefore follow that we could simply unwind globalization in a relatively painless way and get back what we had lost? And there's this concept in social science, it's called path dependency, which suggests that once you're far down a path, even if you conclude you're maybe not on the best path, it's often not possible to walk back to the beginning of the path and get on the better path, right? To use the hiking metaphor, well, if you took the wrong path and it's longer and rougher than the path you want to take, but it still ultimately goes to where you were intending to go to. And as opposed to continuing to take it, you turn around and go back. Well, night may fall before you get on the good path and get to where you need to be. You just got to stay with the path you're on, right? And the idea that somehow we can magically unwind everything that has happened in the global economy over the last 40 or 60 years seems to me to be obviously magical thinking. And so I'm going to be concrete here. And so I've been listening to and reading up on some of the economics of this. And there's a economist who suggests that the average American-made car, right, a Ford, has components that are made in Mexico and Canada. But those components don't just come to, call it Dearborn, Michigan, and get put together. Actually take the door, right? The door, just as an illustration, starts maybe in Dearborn. They create the frame, but then it is shipped to Canada to get, let's say, the window assembly put into it. And then it's shipped back to Dearborn, and some more work is done on it. And then it's shipped to um, Mexico to get the panel put on it. And then it's shipped back to Canada to get some of the electronics or the handle or the switch put into it. And basically, all said and done, the components of the vehicles that we think of as American made have crossed the border between Canada, the United States, and Mexico dozens of times by the time the vehicle is complete. And the way in which the tariffs that are set to be implemented on Tuesday are written, each time those components pass the border from Mexico or Canada to the United States, 25% tariff is going to be imposed on it. And so the question is, how much more expensive is that going to make American-made cars, right? And will Ford ultimately conclude, look, this just doesn't work? And by the way, it's really hard to build new factories and to attract affordable labor in the United States. There's a whole permitting process to build the factory, and then you got to train the labor. And by the way, the United States doesn't do a lot of vocational education. We're not going to get a lot of assistance. Actually, maybe it would be better to build Fords in Asia and Europe and completely build them there, and then import them once to the United States and just pay that tariff once, right? And so one of the economists I'm reading suggests actually the effects of these tariffs may be to eliminate automobile production in North America and the way that we've known it for over 100 years now. Maybe Tesla will stay here, but Ford and GM, Chrysler will go elsewhere, right? And that is obviously counterproductive, not at all what we intend, but this, right, reflects the idea that you can't just unwind, you can't just go backwards, you can't counteract the economic trend you don't like by simply trying to return to a world that is now outmoded, right? We rely on globally integrated productive processes if we're also upset about inequality and about precariousness. We want to restore the middle class. We have to figure out a way of doing that that doesn't involve magical thinking and pursuing policy that is highly destructive. So if this is all right, why is it tempting to Donald Trump and his administration to rely on tariffs as their primary tool for economic policy? And here I'll say, first of all, it's the only available vehicle for channeling the politics of resentment once progressive alternatives are foreclosed. If you're not going to do progressive taxation, if you're not willing to do wealth taxation, if you're not willing to reinvest in the paths of mobility, in high quality public education, in greater support for college education, in a knowledge economy, in affordable housing, and better public transportation so that people can get to where the good jobs are, but where the affordability crisis really cuts deep, then you got to have something else, right? And at least doing tariffs, Trump can say, I'm doing something. I hear you, I see you, I feel your pain, and this is my response. And it turns out, right, we go back to the polls. It looks like 50% of the American public, more or less right now, is convinced by the idea that, well, Donald Trump is doing something for us, and therefore we're going to continue to support him. It's attractive to core supporters of Trumpian populism because it is, in fact, a further form of regressive taxation. And here I want to point to, right, Elon Musk and the petroleum oligarchs and the other very wealthy people who have funneled all of this money into Trump's campaigns and who are using their money to allow Trump to have a stranglehold over the Republican Party. And for these people, having permanent cuts in the highest level income taxes and corporate taxes, in the taxes that bite most the wealthiest among us, the most concentrated sources of wealth among us, and paying for it, right? Because those tax cuts have to be paid for somehow via another regressive consumption tax. Well, this allows the richest among us to hold on to all their wealth and forces the poorest among us to pay for it. And yet the poorest among us seem to support it, at least a lot of them, a lot of us, because, well, it's Trump doing something, and there's a theory behind it. It's all China's fault. It's all about globalization. The global elite are the ones who are the source of all our woes. Tariffs punish them. This is the right way to restore the middle class, to restore union labor, to restore manufacturing, to make the American economy equitable and great again. By the way, the idea that you shouldn't listen to the mainstream economists when they tell you this is going to be a catastrophe, because the mainstream economists also told you that neoliberalism was going to be great for you, that globalism was going to be great for you. And so don't listen to them anymore. They are discredited. And I would point out very quickly, I'm not going to have time to do it today, but when we get to it soon, that we should be paying attention to Stephen Moran, right? He's the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. We should be paying attention to Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Wilbur Ross, the former Treasury Secretary, Pete Navarro, one of the president's most trusted economic advisors, and they're all saying, don't listen to the economic experts. And by the way, in the social media universe we live in, it's pretty easy to get information that supports what you want to do instinctively or on the basis of your gut, or because you like having a tool that lets you act unilaterally. And then the final consideration, I think this is important, that this is a way of reasserting American greatness, where greatness here really means power, the capacity to use our economic might, our military might, to bully and cow the rest of the world into doing what we want it to do, returning to a kind of 19th century great power sentiment. By the way, in many ways, this appears to be a new kind of mercantilism, right? You are going to be part of our sphere of influence, in which case maybe we'll release you from some of the tariffs, but everybody else, we're not going to let their goods come into our country without huge tribute being paid. And so the idea that greatness here means power in the sense of unilateral might that can be used capriciously to bully other countries and shows American dominance. I think this is very attractive to Donald Trump. So the fact that it fits an economic theory that advisors around him are propounding and seems to have some credibility, their white papers, etc., that support it, is very attractive politically and, if you will, dispositionally to Donald Trump, even if it turns out to be a terrible economic argument. All right, I will stop there. I just want to, not lose the forest for the trees. The idea that there are a lot of good alternative economic tools to address the problems that I think are real problems that Donald Trump's supporters are reacting to. But if you foreclose those alternatives, then the only thing left is the one tool, tariffs, and it turns out to be a self-defeating tool. That's a good account of how we are getting into this cul-de-sac in economic policy. Who wants to start us out today? Thought, question, comment. Want to hear what you think. David, are you getting ready?
Yeah, I am.
Uh,
Hang on a second here. Yeah, I there was an article in the Washington Post, and by the way, I stopped my subscription to the Washington Post, but they keep sending it to me anyway. But at any rate, saying that not only is Trump listening to some close advisors, other close advisors have encouraged him to take a conciliatory approach, but he's actually ignoring what they have to say. I don't. The article isn't too specific about which advisors want him to slow down on tariffs and which ones want him to go ahead, but apparently some on the inner circle have said you've gone far enough, back off a little, and he's doubling down anyway.
yeah, and my understanding here, David, is that there's not uniformity, right, within the people who are giving the president advice, um, and that even among the people who support tariffs, there are different views of how
Yeah.
to use tariffs and why they're a good tool. And some of the views, the Stephen Moran view, is that they're a great long-term strategy for unwinding the global economy and bringing the jobs back here. So other people think they may be better as a short-term tool to give countries incentives to bend to our will, and then once they've given us the concessions we want, remove the tariffs. And I think we just have to remember, right, that Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand economics very well. He doesn't seem to listen very well to complex advice in general, right? And so that in these circumstances, probably you shouldn't expect that the president is going to implement a stable policy informed only by one way of looking at the world. Right. And there might be some good news in that, right? If he keeps changing his mind, maybe some of the damage that sustained long-term tariffs would do can be avoided.
Well, the article also indicated that the people who want him to slow down and back off a bit are people with strong ties to Wall Street and the
Right,
stock market. Yeah.
right. Yeah, and I think one of the questions here is um, how much does Donald Trump care about whether or not ultimately there's long-term growth in the stock market over his presidency? He seemed to be very proud of that in his first term. And even more deeply, right, the stock market may matter to those of us who have our retirement funds caught up.
Exactly.
But and
Like,
and by the way, I just saw data. I didn't put it into today's slide, but that the investment in stocks is the highest portion of American assets that it's ever been. It's up to about 45% of our assets of all Americans are in stocks. And so that pain is going to be pretty widely distributed. But having said that, how much does he also care about the real economy? Because frankly, right, it's one thing to crash the stock market. It's another thing to generate a big recession, to generate joblessness, to potentially lead people to lose their homes, to lead to really difficult choices for the Federal Reserve. If you remember, to get out of stagflation last time, Paul Volcker did what's called the shock, right? He raised interest rates really high, and that resulted in a long, steep recession. And, that's really bad for a whole generation, especially the people who are entering the job market. It suppresses their lifetime earnings, not just their earnings in the period in which the recession occurs. I don't suppose we should need reminding about this, given that 2008 is not that long ago. But a bad recession is really bad for everyone, not just people who own stocks and are invested for their retirement. And I don't know to what degree he cares. It does appear that one of
Of
the
course,
things,
a lot of us.
David, I think you muted yourself accidentally. David, I can't hear you. Yeah, I think something's gone wrong with your microphone. Sorry. Yeah, I'll just continue the thought for a second. The people like Stephen Moran, right? And this is just one set of advisors that he's listening to. It's not the totality, as David points out, are saying, look, and Moran has a metaphor for this that I think is worth mentioning, that there's a narrow path in which this strategy works, which means basically that the combination of the attractiveness of the American market, everybody wants to sell their goods here, right? Because we have more purchasing power than any country in the world. The dominance of the American dollar, right? We are the de facto world currency and our government controls it. And the fact of our military might, right? Canada really is dependent upon us for its defense. It relies on us to, for instance, patrol the Atlantic, right? The combination of those sources of power lead us to be able to bully the countries that we want to do what we want them to do, doing what we want them to do, and we emerge from a recession of a couple years with a much better economy, right? Um, and so Moran says, yeah, you may have to crash the stock market, you may have to cause a recession, but the pain is worth it. The metaphor that's used is detoxing, right? When you go cold turkey, you're going to be experiencing withdrawal for a little while. We've come to rely too much on debt, too much on cheap imports, too much on financial sectors, and not enough on manufacturing. The cost of reorganizing our economy and reorganizing the world economy in order to be able to reorganize our economy is that we're going to suffer for a while. But when we get out of it, right, Donald Trump will have made America great again. We'll have restored an economy that works for all of us, and it's worth it. And Donald Trump finds that idea very attractive, right? Now, I don't think the theory works at all, but at least Moran has the honesty to admit that the path is narrow, right? And by the way, what happens when you're walking a narrow path with an impetuous, unreliable, hothead president at the lead of your operation? Well, it gets pretty likely that you're going to have some missteps. And if you're on a narrow path and it's a steep cliff on the side, that's not a good scenario, right? So yeah, I do worry, frankly, that Trump is choosing Moran in the way that the drunk leans on the light post. Yeah. All right, David, I can hear you now. I don't know if you want to complete the thought.
Oh no, I just wanted to pick up on your "Make America Great Again." I think Trump has accomplished MAGA agenda, but a different MAGA agenda. It's "Make America Gullible Again."
Mm. Nice. Yeah. And by the way, if great just means strong, just means bullying, just means, using our power so that people know that we're powerful, then maybe tariffs works as well.
Yeah.
Again, I spoke with you about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about the pivot in our foreign policy, the idea that actually the world is not a zero-sum place, and that actually we benefit from things that benefit Canada as well. We benefit from things that benefit Mexico and Europe and even China, right? And yes, we do want to have a stable middle class and not have as much inequality and do have the capacity of the middle class to afford to buy their homes again. But frankly, the better way to get there is probably not through blowing up the world economy, right? It's through pursuing reform at home. And that is not what Trump is willing to do. And so he's left with this one tool, and that's what he's going to use. Um, Anybody else with a thought or a question or a comment for today? There's a lot of stuff happening in American politics and in the world that I decided just to ignore in order to be able to do justice to tariffs today. I didn't get as far as I wanted, but I think I got you enough information to begin thinking about this. Um, Anybody have anything else that's really urgent to discuss? If not, I'm going to go eat lunch and wish you all well. And so that's next weekend that you guys will be going off to this protest. We'll figure out what we're going to do with this class for next weekend over the next few days. All right, everybody. Good being with you. Be well. Take care. Fight the good fight. And I will see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.